Nadia had known hunger before she knew how to read, born into extreme poverty. She grew up in a leaking shack with a sickly mother and 3 younger siblings who depended on her for survival. She dreamed of education, but school fees were a luxury they could never afford. When her mother died, the weight of responsibility fell entirely on her. At just 16, she took whatever job she could find, scrubbing floors, washing clothes, selling vegetables at the market. Anything to keep her siblings fed. But life was merciless. One by one, her younger siblings were sent away to distant relatives, and she was left alone in the world, struggling to survive. She never gave up on education, though, even after dropping out, she kept her books, studying by candlelight whenever she could. She dreamed of a future where she could afford to finish school, go to university, and break free from the chains of poverty. Then came the opportunity that changed her life. Through a stroke of luck, Nadia secured a job as a maid at the Monroe estate, a sprawling mansion owned by Alexander Monroe, a billionaire widower known for his kindness. Unlike the other wealthy families she had worked for, Monroe's staff spoke highly of him. They said he was generous, fair, and not the kind of man who treated his workers like dirt beneath his feet. Still, Nadia didn't expect much. She had seen too much cruelty to believe in kindness. At first, she kept her head down, working tirelessly from dawn until late at night. She scrubbed the marble floors, polished the chandeliers, and made sure her work was flawless. The other maids often whispered about Mr. Monroe, how his wife had died 5 years ago in a tragic accident, how he had never remarried despite being one of the most desirable men in the country. Alexander was not like the other rich men she had encountered. He greeted his staff politely, never raised his voice, and even noticed when someone was struggling. One evening, he found Nadia sitting in a quiet corner of the kitchen, scribbling math problems into an old notebook. "You study after work?" he asked, surprised. Nadia quickly stood up, embarrassed. "Yes, sir. I want to complete my education." Something in her voice caught his attention. Unlike many people who worked in his house, she wasn't just surviving. She was fighting for something greater. Over time, Alexander found himself noticing her more. The way she never complained, even when the other maids gossiped about her. The way she worked late, but still stayed up to study. The quiet strength in her eyes, as if she had survived more pain than anyone should. One evening, as she was cleaning his study, she accidentally knocked over a stack of books. She scrambled to pick them up, mortified, but Alexander knelt to help her. "You read?" he asked, noticing a literature textbook among the fallen books. She nodded. "I try to when I have time." That night, he left a book on the kitchen counter for her. A small gesture, but one that meant everything. Little by little, they began to talk. He would ask about her studies, and she would shyly respond. Eventually, he offered to help her pay for night school. At first, she refused. Pride wouldn't let her take charity, but he convinced her that it wasn't charity, but an investment in someone who deserved a chance. The more he learned about her, the more he admired her, and without realizing it, admiration turned into something deeper. But love between a billionaire and a maid is never simple. The first person to notice was Helen Monroe, Alexander's older sister. She was furious. "You can't be serious," she hissed at him during a private conversation. "She's a maid. What do you think people will say?" His business partners, friends, and even his in-laws voiced their disapproval. "She's after your money," they warned. "She's a nobody from the streets. What could she possibly offer you?" But the worst of them all was Lillian, Alexander's late wife's best friend. She had loved him from afar for years, waiting for him to move on, believing she would be the one he chose. When she found out about Nadia, she was livid. "She's using you," Lillian told him one evening, a glass of wine in her hand. "She plays innocent, but women like her know exactly what they're doing." When Alexander didn't listen, Lillian took matters into her own hands. Rumors started spreading. People whispered that Nadia was a thief, that she had been caught sneaking into Alexander's private study. The staff suddenly turned against her. Then, one evening, one of the house managers accused her of stealing a gold bracelet. The evidence? A bracelet found in her bag. But Nadia had never seen it before. Security was called. She was humiliated in front of the entire staff. But before they could throw her out, Alexander arrived. "Stop," he said, his voice dangerously calm. He turned to Nadia. "Did you take it?" Tears filled her eyes, but she held her ground. "No, sir, I would never." Alexander looked around, then at Lillian, who stood in the corner, watching. He knew. "This was planted," he said coldly. "She's innocent." Lillian's face turned pale. Alexander fired the house manager and cut ties with the people who had plotted against Nadia. He didn't care about the backlash. He didn't care that society would never accept their love. That night, he confessed his feelings for her. "I don't care where you come from, Nadia," he told her. "You are worth more than anyone in this house." For the first time in her life, someone saw her, not as a poor maid, but as a woman deserving of love. But love alone wasn't enough. The world never stopped looking down on her. The gossip never ended. His family never fully accepted her, and the pressure was unbearable. One night, Nadia made the hardest decision of her life. She left. She disappeared, leaving only a letter behind. _ Alexander, I love you, but I cannot be the reason you lose everything. You deserve someone the world will respect. Someone worthy. I will always love you, but I must go. _ She vanished into the night, heartbroken but determined. Alexander searched for her for months, but she had gone too far. Eventually, he stopped looking. Years later, they met again. Nadia had built a life of her own. She had graduated, become a teacher, and though she was no longer poor, she had but determined. Alexander searched for her for months, but she had gone too far. Eventually, he stopped looking. Years later, they met again. Nadia had built a life of her own. She had graduated, become a teacher, and though she was no longer poor, she had scars that never fully healed. Alexander was still single. He had never loved anyone the way he loved her. They shared a long look, filled with everything they had lost. "You look well," he said softly. "So do you," she whispered. Neither of them said the words they were thinking. Sometimes love isn't about winning. Sometimes it's about knowing when to let go. And as they walked away from each other for the last time, both knew they would never forget